The ground convulsed beneath Kaelin's knees, sending ripples through the fractured marble floor of the temple of shattered mirrors. The air itself seemed to tremble, humming with the unnatural resonance of tearing dimensions. Above her, the vaulted ceiling split with a sound like stones screaming, and from the cracks, suspended shards of mirror drifted down, not falling, but hanging in mid-air, each one rotating slowly, catching the dim light of the warp sigils she'd carved into the floor. They reflected not her, but hundreds of fractured futures. One shard showed Orleans' skyline collapsing beneath a storm of alien fire, another the oceans boiling into clouds of crimson steam. In one, she saw her sister's young son, eyes wide in terror, engulfed by the obsidian fangs of a Zir predator. In another, she saw herself, arms clawing at nothing, being dragged backward into a lightless abyss. The images spun around her like a storm of truth, every one of them a death sentence. Her breath came in sharp bursts. She had trained for years to focus through the noise of prophecy, to pull threads from chaos. But this was different. These were not visions drifting toward possibility. They were converging, all timelines sharpening into the same single blade poised to fall. The warp patterns beneath her pulsed, blood-red lines weaving in and out of the intricate geometry, fed by her own life force. She pressed both palms to the sigils and whispered syllables older than any written history. The temple doors exploded inward. Tryon, the High Counselor, strode in like a wave of wrath, the ceremonial white of his robe streaked with dust. In his hand a blade of condensed plasma flared to life, casting his gaunt face in harsh light. "Kaelin!" His voice cracked through the quake. "What in all dimensions are you doing?" She didn't answer. Her gaze remained locked on the central sigil, the place where the warp threads were beginning to twist in on themselves, condensing into a breach. Tryon's eyes darted to the mirrors above, just in time to catch a shard flash with his own face, dead, half buried under alien wreckage. His lips thinned. He moved. With a single step, he slashed downward. The plasma edge tore through the outer ring of symbols, sparks erupting in blue fire. The temple's air pressure dropped sharply, making his robe snap like a flag in a gale. "You're summoning it," he spat, voice tight with something between rage and fear. "You're inviting the very beasts that will unmake us." Kaelin's head lifted slowly. Blood ran from both eyes, cutting narrow trails down her cheeks. "No," she said, voice low but carrying through the roaring in the air. "I'm calling the only things that can kill them." Another shard spun before her, this one showing a fleet of Zir war barges descending on the capital, their hulls layered with moving chitin, their weapons melting towers into slag. In its corner a shadow moved, vast, monstrous, not Zir, but something else, its outline fractured and wrong, as if the universe itself could not decide what shape it should take. The breach widened. A sound began, distant at first, then growing, a deep, resonant vibration that was less heard than felt, crawling into the bones. The sigils blazed brighter, no longer just red, but streaked with impossible colors, hues that made the edges of vision ache. The mirrors trembled violently. "Stop this!" Tryon shouted over the building roar. "You'll collapse the whole timeline." He stepped forward, trying to break the inner ring with another strike. Kaelin moved faster. Her hand shot out, gripping his wrist in a hold like iron. "I've seen every ending you cling to," she said, her voice cracking but unyielding. "They all end the same, in fire, in silence, in nothing. This is the only way." He tried to pull back. "You don't even know if you can control what comes through." Her gaze didn't waver. "I don't need to control it. I just need to point it in the right direction once." The vibrations swelled into a thunderclap without sound, a pressure that pushed the breath from their lungs. The central sigil tore open, light spilling upward like molten glass poured in reverse. And from within that impossible light came the sound, a roar that had no origin, as if the fabric of reality itself had bellowed in pain and fury. It was not just loud. It was dimensional. It rattled the marrow, throbbed in the skull, made the heart falter in its rhythm. Above them, the mirrors exploded. Hundreds of shards became a storm, spinning outward in a deadly ring, their visions flickering like dying stars. For an instant, all the futures she had seen were gone, replaced by one vast shape pressing against the breach from the other side. Tryon stumbled back, his blade dimming as if even its plasma feared the thing behind the rift. "Gods help us," he whispered. Kaelin rose slowly, her legs trembling but steadying under her will. The roar came again, this time accompanied by a shadowed outline pushing further into view. Tendrils of temporal distortion curled from it, brushing against the temple columns, making stone warp and bend as though it were liquid. The sigils buckled one by one, and the light grew too bright to look at directly. "Once it steps through," Tryon said, his voice hoarse, "there's no undoing this." Kalen's blood-smeared mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "I know." The breach split fully. The air convulsed, the temple floor cracking in spirals beneath their feet. That monstrous presence surged forward, its arrival marked by a final, shattering crash as the last mirror fell. And then, with the force of a collapsing star, the first claw emerged. The edge of the rift was never still, even in her earliest memories. Kalen recalled the way the horizon there shifted like cracked glass under pressure. Shards of reality sliding against each other with an almost metallic groan. The air was never the same temperature twice in the same moment. The light bending and twisting so that shadows fell in directions that made no sense. It was a place where the rules of time wore thin, and for those unlucky enough to be born along its borders. It was a constant reminder that existence could simply slip away. She had been 9 when it happened. One moment her mother was holding her hand, scolding her for wandering too close to the unstable fields. The next, the light fractured, her father's voice cut off mid-laugh. She turned and found herself standing alone in an expanse of shimmering dust. No bodies, no blood, just absence, clean and absolute. The rift had taken them, erasing their existence from the record of the universe, leaving Kalen with memories no one else shared. To the rest of the settlement, her parents had never existed. That was the first time she learned the truth. Time could be crueler than any enemy. Years passed, and she grew under the guardianship of the Chrono Order, a cloister of monks and technicians who kept vigil over the rift. They trained her to read the subtle rhythms in the distortion, to recognize when timelines shifted, and eventually to pierce the veil entirely. The talent they praised in her was the same curse she hated. Visions came, unbidden, drowning her in sights and sensations from countless possible tomorrows. Some were small, a glass slipping from a hand, a child scraping a knee. Others were cataclysmic, cities burning, skies cracking open, oceans pulled into the void. Every time she saw death, she felt it as if it were her own. The screams lodged in her chest. The smells of blood and smoke clung to her skin long after she woke. She learned to steel herself, to stand unmoved before horrors that would shatter lesser minds. The elders called her discipline. She knew it was something colder. The visions taught her that fate was no fixed thread. It was a snarl of possibilities, most of them cruel. She stopped believing in destiny. In its place, she believed in will. If survival demanded ruthless action, she would act. Mercy was for those who had the luxury of safety. That conviction hardened into steel the day she saw the Zyre for the first time. It had been in a vision, nothing more than a flicker of a moment, but it left her breathless. Towering forms of living obsidian, their bodies glistening with chitin plates that rippled like the surface of oil. Eyes like molten gold, unblinking, fixed on the heart of Orline's capital. The air around them warped as they moved, as though space itself recoiled from their presence. She had felt her bones trying to grind themselves to powder in the vision, the crushing pressure of their approach. That was years ago. She had not told anyone. No one would believe it, not until it was too late. Her most recent vision was worse. She had been pulled under with such force it nearly stopped her heart. One moment she was kneeling in the meditation chamber. The next she was riding the back of a colossal being, unlike anything in known history. It was Kronos, the name had come to her unbidden, a beast stitched together from fragments of 1,000 different times. Its hide shimmered with landscapes, storms, and battlefields from centuries apart. Each step it took cracked the ground in one era and shook the sky in another. In the vision, she drove it straight into the core of the Tsar fleet, tearing their war barges apart as if they were paper. But victory was not the end of the vision. She saw Orline burning, its people scattering in terror as Kronos turned its many-eyed gaze on the city it had just saved. The warp energy bled into the streets, twisting metal and stone, shattering minds. The message was clear. This was no salvation without cost. She woke drenched in sweat, the echo of Kronos' roar still reverberating in her skull. She sat there for hours, weighing the images in her mind, trying to find another path. There wasn't one. Every branch she followed ended in extinction unless she used Kronos. That morning she called her apprentice into the chamber. The young man was barely past his training years, still wearing the blue sashes of an initiate. He had always looked at her with an almost worshipful trust, the kind that made her uneasy. Now he stood in the doorway, hesitant. "You called for me, seer?" She gestured for him to step closer. "I saw the end again. I saw how we survive." His brow furrowed. "And," she met his gaze, letting the weight of her words settle before she spoke, "we cannot survive without summoning what should never be summoned." The color drained from his face. You mean the forbidden gates, the warp beasts. One beast, she corrected. The only one that can kill the Zir before they end us. He hesitated, then asked the question she had been expecting. If you do this, what will it cost? She didn't look away. Everything. Silence stretched between them. Outside, the distant groan of the rift rolled across the horizon like a warning. Finally, he spoke again, his voice low. If you have to destroy the city to save humanity, will it still be worth it? Kalen's reply was quiet, but there was no hesitation in it. If I don't destroy the city, there will be no humanity left to save. He flinched as if struck, but said nothing more. She could see the conflict in his eyes, fear of what she proposed, and fear of the alternative. She didn't ask for his approval. Approval was a luxury she no longer had time for. That night, she stood alone on the edge of the rift, watching the warped stars shimmer and bleed into shapes no human eye was meant to see. The air was sharp with the scent of ozone, the thin veil between realities humming like the breath of some enormous creature. She thought of her parents, of the way the world had rewritten itself the day they vanished. She thought of the countless deaths she had lived in her visions, each one pressing against her ribs until her chest felt hollow, and she thought of Kronos, waiting beyond the veil, a force that could end the Zir and perhaps everything else. Her hands tightened into fists. She had never been a believer in destiny, but for the first time in her life she felt something close to it. Not the promise of a fixed future, but the cold certainty that every road now led to the same impossible choice. And she would make it. The first tear in the sky appeared just after dawn, a thin line of light that shimmered like heated metal against the still dark horizon. Kalen stood on the balcony of the temple's eastern spire, watching it split into branching fractures, each one spidering outward until the entire dome of the heavens resembled cracked glass. The fractures pulsed faintly, arcs of static flickering along their lengths, as though the air itself had become an electrified web. By the time the third tier opened over the southern quarter, the sensors along the border stations began to scream. Data streams flooded into the temple's comm hall readings from the outpost arrays reporting gravitational anomalies and dimensional shear. Then came the unmistakable signature, Zir Warp Wakes. The border stations confirmed it within minutes. An invasion fleet was sliding into this dimension. Not all at once, but in jagged bursts, like claws hooking through fabric. It was exactly as she had foreseen. Kalen wasted no time. She strode into the council chamber, where the high elders sat around the obsidian table, faces etched with the calm detachment of men who thought themselves untouchable. The air smelled faintly of incense and old dust, a contrast to the electric violence outside. "You have 72 hours, she said without preamble, her voice cutting across the murmur of attendance. No more. The Zir fleet will complete its translation into our space by then. If you wait for proof beyond this, you will be counting corpses." Some glanced at one another. Tryon, the High Counselor, leaned back in his seat. "Visions again," he said, a hint of mockery in his tone. "You've been wrong before." "Never about this," Kalen replied. "I have seen the fleet. I have felt the ground break under their advance." "Velt," another elder said dryly. "Not measured." "Not confirmed. You speak in shadows and expect us to move the world." She took a step forward, her hands pressed flat to the cold stone table. "Gah!" "If you do nothing, there will be no world left to move." Their silence was worse than outright refusal. It was dismissal. She saw it in their eyes. The decision already made, the weight of her words dismissed as the ravings of a cursed seer. When she turned and left the chamber, it was with a kind of cold certainty that came only when every bridge had already been burned. That night, under the shadow of the temple's outer walls, Kalen moved like a blade through darkness. She knew the path to the sealed vault by heart. The monks who had raised her had thought teaching her the temples. Architecture would instill reverence. Instead, it had given her the knowledge to bypass its defenses. The vault lay deep beneath the central spire, a chamber carved into the bedrock itself. Twin doors of alloyed steel and temporal glass barred the way, engraved with the sigils of the old order. The air hummed faintly with a containment field inside. She pressed her palm to the sigil plate, flooding it with a pulse of her own warped resonance. The lock resisted. It recognized her identity, but not her clearance. She whispered a phrase in the dead tongue of the Riftwalkers, and the mechanism shuddered. The doors opened with the groan of something ancient being disturbed. Inside, suspended in a lattice of containment beams, floated the object she had come for, a warp core of the first generation. It was the size of a man's torso, its surface a swirling lattice of colors no human eye was meant to perceive, constantly folding and unfolding like the skin of some impossible creature. This was the kind of technology that had destroyed an entire planet in the first Rift War. So dangerous it had been, locked away for centuries. Kaelin stepped forward, her boots ringing softly against the vault floor. She reached up, disengaging the containment nodes one by one. As each node went dark, the air grew heavier, pressing against her lungs. When the last was gone, the core dropped into her hands with the weight of a dying star. A voice came from the shadows. "You're breaking the seal," the man said. He stepped into the light, a temple guard, his silver armor catching the glow from the core. His hand hovered near the haft of his shock spear. "You're betraying the oath you swore to protect this place." Kaelin didn't look away from him. "I broke that oath the moment my first prophecy came true," she said evenly. "When I learned that guarding relics means nothing if there's no one left to guard." His jaw tightened. "If the council finds out—" "They won't," she cut in. "And if they do, I'll already be beyond their reach." He hesitated, torn between duty and the dread pooling in his eyes. Finally he stepped back, lowering the spear. "You can't control what you're trying to bring here," he said. "Maybe not," she replied, cradling the core, "but I can aim it." She moved past him, the warp core thrumming against her ribs. The corridors back to the surface felt narrower than before, the shadows longer. The air charged with the metallic taste of imminent disaster. Every step echoed with the knowledge that what she carried could burn worlds from existence, and that she intended to use it. She had just reached the temple's outer gates when the first sirens began to wail. At first she thought the council had discovered her theft. Then she heard the other sound, low and resonant, beneath the mechanical howl. The rhythmic pounding of something vast, moving through the atmosphere. The city's warning system flared red across the skyline, and a voice boomed from the public address towers. "All citizens! Take shelter immediately. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." Kaelin stopped in the middle of the street, her grip on the core tightening. The scent of ozone was thicker now, mingled with something metallic and sharp. She looked up. Above the city, the fractures in the sky were no longer static lines. They were widening, curling into spirals of white-hot light. Shapes moved within them, massive and insectile, their outlines barely coherent in this dimension. The Zir had arrived 48 hours ahead of her prediction, and there would be no more time for warnings. The city of Orleans shook as though some unseen giant had gripped it in both hands and tried to twist it apart. Stone facades cracked and rained dust onto the streets. The ground itself heaved, splitting open in jagged lines that spat bursts of light from far deeper than magma. Above, the towers of the plasma defense grid flared and fired in ragged intervals, but the beams didn't travel straight. They bent mid-air, warping away from their targets, curling back in arcs that made no sense, physics folding in on itself like paper. Some shots ricocheted into the sea, boiling the water in instant clouds of steam. Others doubled back and struck the very towers that fired them, detonating in blooms of blue fire. The Zir ships hung above the chaos like obsidian monoliths, their hulls rippling with a liquid darkness that seemed to swallow light whole. From their undersides, tendrils of warped matter reached down into the city, extracting screaming figures and flickers of motion too fast to track. Kaelin pushed through the panicked crowd, the stolen warp core strapped across her back, its steady, bone-deep thrum vibrating through her ribs. Every step toward the center of the Grand Plaza was a fight against the tide of fleeing civilians. The plaza itself was a fractured expanse of stone, open to the bleeding sky. Ha! With the ancient sigil platform embedded at its heart, a relic from before the Rift Wars. Its markings so old that most historians dismissed them as decoration. Kaelin knew better. She had spent years studying them in secret, piecing together the activation sequence from forbidden texts. She reached the center and dropped to her knees, unhooking the core and placing it in the exact center of the largest spiral. Around her, the roar of the city's collapse was deafening, the groan of collapsing buildings, the crackle of bending metal, the distant thunder of the sea being pulled upward in impossible waves. She began to trace the summoning lines with both hands, the motions precise and swift, her fingertips igniting the dormant carvings with lines of molten gold. A shout cut through the din. "Kaelin!" She glanced up to see Joran, her only remaining ally, pushing toward her through the stampede. His armor was scorched, one shoulder blackened from some near miss. In his hand was a shock spear, but it hung low, more for balance than threat. He stopped just short of the platform, his eyes locked on the warp core. "Tell me you're not about to do what I think you're about to do." She kept her focus on the sigils. "If you think I'm about to open the only door that leads to our survival, then yes." Joran stepped closer, his voice sharp with fear. "Aye! If the thing you called through decides we're just another enemy." Kaelin didn't pause. The last ring of sigils flared to life, casting both of them in a fierce golden glow. "Then I'll kill it myself," she said, meeting his gaze for the first time, "or die trying." He stared at her for a long moment, then gave a short, bitter laugh. "I believe you'd try." He stepped back, his knuckles white around the spear. "Gods help us all!" She closed her eyes and pressed her palms to the spiral's heart. The warp core thrummed louder, matching the quickening beat of her heart. She could feel the edges of reality flexing around her, the way one might feel the skin of a drum stretch before it splits. The air in the plaza grew heavier, pulling inward toward the center, dragging dust and debris in lazy spirals around her. Above, the largest Xur warship shifted position, as if sensing something. Its tendrils began to draw back. Kaelin's lips moved, the ancient syllables spilling from her throat like liquid metal. The platform beneath her feet lit fully, lines of light leaping up into the air, weaving together to form a vertical ring. The moment the final syllable left her mouth, the ring ignited. It didn't blaze with light, it swallowed it. A disk of pure black, deeper than shadow, expanded outward, its edge rimmed with a corona of colors the human eye could barely comprehend. The sound that came with it was not a boom or a crack, but a deep, resonant tearing, like the world itself was being ripped open along a hidden seam. The gravitational pull doubled, then tripled, making her knees buckle. The crowd that had been fleeing moments ago froze, many clutching at their ears or falling to the ground as the voids. Pressure clawed into their skulls. Joran braced himself against the toppled column, staring into the abyssal circle with something between awe and terror. From within the blackness came motion, not the motion of something stepping forward, but the motion of moments, an endless layering of instants moving over and through each other. A vast, clawed limb emerged, its surface a shifting collage of landscapes, battles, and skies from across centuries. One moment it bore the cracked texture of a desert long dead, the next the sheen of ocean waves under an alien moon. Kronos stepped through. The plaza buckled under the weight of its presence. Its body was a monstrosity of time and matter, stitched together by forces that defied logic, segments of armor plate from wars yet to come, fused with organic muscle from ages long past. Its head, crowned with jagged horns that seemed to phase in and out of existence, turned slowly toward the sky where the Zyra ships hovered. Its many eyes, each showing a different slice of history, locked onto the nearest war barge. It roared, and the sound was a disaster given form. Windows shattered for blocks around. Stone cracked and splintered. Some swore later they felt their memories skip, as though a moment of their lives had been erased by the sheer force of the sound. In a single, impossible leap, Kronos closed the distance to the nearest Xur warship. Its claws punched through the hull like paper, rending metal and alien chitin alike. The ship convulsed, its hull folding inward as if collapsing into another dimension, then exploded in a blossom of black fire. The shock wave flattened smaller craft in its wake. Kronos landed back in the plaza, the ground splitting under its weight. Without pause, it launched itself again, this time into the midst of two more ships that had begun to fire desperately. Their plasma beams twisted and bent away from it, unable to find a path through the distorted space around its form. In one sweeping motion, it tore both vessels apart, scattering burning fragments into the sea below. The plaza was chaos now, civilians fleeing in every direction, Joran shouting orders to any guard still standing. Kaelin remained at the center, her hands still on the platform's core, feeding the breach with her will. She could feel Kronos' mind, a cold, alien river brushing against hers. It did not think as humans did. It did not recognize her as friend or foe. It only recognized direction, momentum, purpose. She pushed a single thought into that vast ancient current. Kill the Zyre! For now, it listened. But deep beneath the roar of battle and the thunder of collapsing ships, she could already feel the question growing in its mind, the question it would one day answer. And then what? The plaza was no longer a battlefield. It was a graveyard in the making. Smoke and fractured light tangled in the air, painting the city in bruised colors. Kronos towered above the ruins, its vast, shifting form a nightmare stitched from 1,000 stolen moments in time. The 3 Xur war barges it had torn apart lay scattered across the sky in burning fragments, their molten remains raining down on the ocean. For a heartbeat, Kaelin thought she had done it, that this gamble had worked. Then Kronos turned its many-eyed gaze downward. The thing's massive clawed limbs came down on a civilian tower at the edge of the plaza, rending its upper floors apart like wet parchment. Screams erupted from within as the structure began to tilt. Debris rained into the streets, crushing those too slow to run. Kaelin's heart slammed against her ribs. The bond between them shivered. warping under the weight of Kronos' alien instincts. To it, everything here was prey. Xur, human, building, it made no distinction. She tightened her grip on the warp platform's heart, forcing her will into the link. The creature paused for a fraction of a second before wrenching another building in half, this time scattering a flock of terrified civilians like insects underfoot. The breach behind her hummed, its black rim pulsing in time with her heartbeat. She knew she had only moments before the creature slipped entirely free of her guidance. The comm unit on her belt crackled. "Kalen," Tryon's voice rasped, sharp and desperate, "you need to shut it down now. Seal the rift. Keep what's left of the city intact." "If I close it," she said without turning, her eyes locked on the rampaging giant, "the Xir flagship will escape. They'll regroup. They'll be back with twice the force." There was a pause, filled only by the distant crash of a collapsing tower, and Tryon came back harsher. "You don't just gamble with your life when you stand there. You gamble with our entire history. Everything we are, everything we've built." Kalen's voice was ice. "History only exists if there are people alive to write it." Another boom shook the plaza as Kronos swung one massive limb through a cluster of smaller Xir skiffs, reducing them to shrapnel. The flagship loomed on the horizon, an obsidian leviathan bristling with energy lances. It was retreating, its prow already beginning to phase into the shimmering fractures above. Joran staggered up beside her, blood streaking the side of his face. "It's leaving," he panted. "If it gets away, it'll come back. We both know that. But if you open the breach wider—" He glanced around at the burning streets, the bodies, the chaos. "Yeah, there won't be a city left to defend." The choice coiled around her throat like a strangling hand. She could feel the breach at her back, a hungry thing that would obey her if she fed it. She could call more of Kronos' kind. Beasts bound, not by loyalty, but by the raw, merciless tide of time. They would tear the flagship apart, and then they would turn on whatever was left. Kronos ripped the remains of the civilian tower from its foundations and hurled them into the distance. The shockwave knocked Kalen to one knee. She felt Joran's hand grip her shoulder, steadying her. But his eyes were on the breach, and she could see the fear there, not of the Xir, but of her. Her comm hissed again. "Kalen," Tryon's voice snapped, "this is an order. Shut it down." Her lips curled in a humorless smile. "You've never had control over me, Tryon. You just thought you did." She rose, planting both hands on the glowing sigils of the warp platform. Her mind dipped into the breach, into the swirling currents of time and possibility. There were words there, not in any language that had ever belonged to this world or any other she knew. They thrummed against her teeth, tasted of metal and storms. Speaking them would be a surrender, a choice to unleash something she could never cage again. Joran's voice was tight. "Kalen, if you do this, there's no going back." She looked at him. "There's never been a way back." "Only forward." She inhaled once, the air sharp with ash and ozone, and then screamed the words. They ripped from her throat like molten iron, shattering the air around her. The breach flared wide, its rim swelling until it devoured half the plaza. From within, shadows surged, colossal shapes pressing against the membrane of reality, their outlines shifting from beasts to storms to mountains that moved. Kronos froze, all of its eyes locking on her. Then it roared, a sound like the collapse of centuries, and turned toward the flagship. In a single, thunderous leap, it launched itself across the sky, its claws extended. The flagship's lances fired in unison, but the beams bent and twisted, dissipating into harmless spirals of light before they could touch the monster. Behind Kronos, the breach bulged, its surface breaking as other shapes began to force their way through. Kalen's knees buckled, her hands shaking as she tried to hold their focus. "Kill the flagship," she hissed into the link, pouring every scrap of her will into the command. Kronos struck. Its claws punched deep into the flagship's hull, ripping through layers of alien chitin and armored plating. The ship shuddered violently, its phasing process interrupted, half of it caught between dimensions. A second blow tore it apart entirely, chunks of it tumbling into the sea below as black fire consumed what remained. Cheers rose from somewhere far away, muted by the roaring in Kalen's head. But she could feel the pressure building behind her, the other beasts pushing through, their minds alien and hungry. She knew she had seconds before the breach overwhelmed her control entirely. Joran shouted something she couldn't hear, her vision blurred, but she held on, forcing the command one last time into Kronos' mind. "Go back! Take them with you!" The monster hesitated, its claws still dripping with the remains of the flagship. Then, with a shuddering roar, it turned and hurled itself back toward the breach, smashing into the others as they emerged. The impact drove them all backward into the black, their forms twisting and dissolving into nothing. Kaelin collapsed to her knees as the breach began to contract, its edges folding in on themselves until it snapped shut with a soundless ripple. The plaza was silent except for the distant crackle of fires and the groans of the wounded. She stared at the place where the breach had been, the ghost of its pole still lingering in her bones. Around her, Aurelene lay in ruins, but the sky above was empty of Zaire. For now, the sky above Aurelene was a fractured wound, bleeding light from places no human had ever seen. Kronos was a living storm in the middle of it, all shifting time-flesh and impossible geometry, its claws sinking deep into the Zaire flagship's hull. Around it, other beasts, summoned through the breach in Kaelin's desperate gamble, tore into the enemy fleet. The war barge's obsidian plating split like brittle bone, exposing writhing golden veins that hissed and screamed as they were severed. The flagship's core ruptured in a flash of black fire, scattering shards of alien chitin and warped metal across the sea. The ocean boiled beneath the wreckage, steam rising in choking clouds. For one heartbeat, Kaelin allowed herself to think they had done it. The Zir fleet was nothing but debris and ash, their tendrils of conquest severed. But then the air shifted, wrong, heavy, and she felt it. The beasts she had called were not retreating. The breach behind her had swollen wider, its edges pulsing like a wound about to burst. The destruction had destabilized the fabric of this dimension, and now the beasts were feeding on it, tearing the opening wider with every breath. The ground split beneath her feet, streets collapsing into yawning voids where the rules of gravity faltered. Buildings twisted in on themselves, their stone folding like cloth before vanishing into nothing. Kaelin staggered to the warp platform, her breath sharp and ragged. The link between her and Kronos was fraying, threads of will slipping through her fingers like sand. If she didn't close the breach now, Aurelene and the world beyond it would be erased. She dropped to her knees, hands pressed to the burning sigils, and felt the breach's pull tear at her mind. Closing it with the core's residual power wouldn't be enough. The rift was too big, the beasts too strong. The only seal that would hold was one bound and living essence, her own. Her vision wavered, the plaza around her flickering between moments, buildings standing whole 1 second and lying in ruins the next. She could feel the pieces of herself beginning to unravel as she pushed deeper into the breach's current. "Somewhere far off," Kronos bellowed, its roar reverberating through her bones. The other beasts were pulling back toward the breach, their massive forms fighting each other to be first through. Joran's voice broke through the din, hoarse and urgent. "Hoarse and urgent! Kaelin, whatever you're doing, stop, you'll kill yourself." She didn't look up. "If I stop, there'll be nothing left to die for." The breach writhed in front of her like a living thing, its black surface flashing with glimpses of alien landscapes, burning cities, endless storms. She reached into it with her mind, felt its hunger clamp down on her like teeth, and gave it what it wanted, not her body, but the spark that anchored her visions, the thread of her soul tied to every possible future she'd ever seen. The pain was beyond pain. It was erasure, as though someone were burning her name out of the universe, letter by letter. She held on long enough to force the beast through, shoving Kronos last, locking her will onto it. "Go, take the rest with you." The monster resisted for a heartbeat, its eyes, 1,000 histories staring back, fixed on her. Then it leapt into the black, and the breach began to fold in on itself. Kaelin felt each fold pass through her like a blade, stripping away pieces she could never reclaim. The last fragment of the rift closed with a sound like a sigh, and silence fell. The plaza was a ruin. Fires smoldered in the husks of buildings. The air was heavy with the smell of scorched metal and the faint tang of ozone. The sea, visible through a new fracture in the city's edge, churned with the wreckage of ships both alien and human. Kaelin collapsed onto her side, the warp core lying cold and dead beside her. Doran was there in seconds, hauling her upright. His face was a mask of relief and fear. "You're alive!" She blinked at him, the motion slow, disoriented. The world was a haze of light and shadow now, shapes without detail. She lifted a trembling hand to her face and realized her eyes no longer burned. They felt empty. Footsteps pounded toward them, and then a smaller voice, uncertain and reverent. Her apprentice knelt beside her, his hands shaking. You did it! You saved everyone!" She turned her head toward the sound of him, her blank eyes fixed in his direction. "How do you know?" "Because," he said, his voice catching, "the sky is clear. The Seer are gone." A faint smile touched her lips. "Good." He hesitated, then asked, almost in a whisper, "But you can't see, can you?" Her smile widened just slightly. "No, not any more." The boy's voice trembled. "You've lost your sight." "I've lost more than that," she said softly. "I've lost every path, every glimpse of what's to come. My visions are gone." The boy swallowed hard. "You gave all of it to close the breach." She tilted her head toward the sound of distant shouting. Not screams of terror now, but voices calling to each other in relief, in disbelief. Somewhere she heard laughter break through the noise, sharp and unsteady, but real. "That's enough for me," she said, her voice steady, despite the exhaustion pulling her down. "I don't need to see, as long as I can still hear them laugh." She let her head rest back against Joran's shoulder, the sound of that laughter threading through the smoke-filled air like the first breath of dawn after a long night. For the first time in years there was no vision pressing against her mind, no grim certainty waiting to be fulfilled. Only the fragile, unmeasured now. In the weeks that followed, Orlean rebuilt in fragments. The skyline was a jagged shadow of what it had been, streets still lined with the skeletons of buildings, and the sea carried the wreckage of ships, both human and alien, far into the horizon. Yet the city lived. People walked the markets again. Children's laughter returned to the air, fragile but persistent. The Zur were gone, at least for now, and the breach was sealed. No one had seen Kronos or the other beast since that day. To most, Kaelin's name became legend almost overnight. They called her the one who opened the gate to the future, and her story spread through the border colonies and beyond. Some spoke of her with awe, painting her as the savior who had faced the impossible and won. Others whispered her name with unease, remembering that the same gate that saved them had nearly destroyed everything. And in those whispers her title became a warning. The seer who dared to wield the forbidden and lived, but at a price that would haunt her forever. She did not live in the heart of the city anymore. When the ceremonies and questions became too much, Kaelin left Orlean quietly, refusing the offers of power, the seats on the council, the guarded chambers in the rebuilt temple. She walked alone to the edge of the rift, the same Kavik where she had been born, the place where her parents had vanished, the place where she had first learned that time was not a river, but a sea full of predators. There, she made her home in the shadow of a cliff that overlooked the shifting horizon. Most days she sat on a worn stone ledge with her knees drawn up, listening. She could no longer see the twisting fractures in the sky, could no longer read the way the light bent on the edge of reality, but she could hear the rifts hum deep and low, like a heartbeat under the earth. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, she thought she heard something else, the distant layered roar of Kronos, carried through the folds of time. Visitors came from time to time, pilgrims, soldiers, curious travelers. They wanted to hear her speak, to tell them how to win their own impossible battles. Kaelin listened patiently, the pale veil of her eyes fixed somewhere beyond them. When they asked for advice, she would give the same answer, her voice steady, as if each word had been carved in her long before they arrived. "Sk man kun fine gun kun pine," she would say, Hisan, she would say, her old tongue shaping the words before she translated. Power is not meant to hold everything. It is meant to choose what is worth holding. If victory forces you to lose yourself, be certain what remains is worth living for. Some left satisfied, others left unsettled, because she never told them how to make that choice. She knew no one could. One afternoon, her former apprentice arrived. He had grown taller, his face sharper, his eyes carrying the weight of battles fought since Orlean. He sat beside her without speaking for a while, just watching the rift breathe. Finally, he asked, "Do you ever regret it, opening the gate, calling that thing here?" Kaelin tilted her head, listening to the faint, impossible echoes that always lived just beyond hearing. "Regret is for choices you could undo," she said. "This one cannot be undone, and even if it could, no, I would make it again." He hesitated, then pressed further. "Even knowing what it cost you?" She turned toward him, her sightless eyes steady. "I lost my visions, yes. But if I had kept them, what good would they be in a world that no longer existed? Sometimes a cost is not measured against what you lose, but against what would have been lost without you." "The boy? No." The man nodded slowly, though she could hear the uncertainty still in his breath. "There are people," he said carefully, "who fear that you've set something free, something we can't ever contain again." Kaelin's lips curved into a faint smile. "They're right to fear it. The beasts are not gone. They are waiting, and if the Zir return, perhaps they will too. The question is not whether you can contain such a thing. The question is—" She paused, letting the wind fill the silence. "If to save your world you must release something it will fear forever, will you still do it?" The apprentice didn't answer. She hadn't expected him to. That was the kind of question you only answered when the choice was in front of you, breathing down your neck. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, Kaelin leaned back on her hands, feeling the wind thread through her white hair. Somewhere deep in the rift the hum shifted, and she could swear she heard the faintest rumble, too distant to be certain, too real to dismiss. She didn't know if it was a warning or a promise. She turned her face toward it, the pale veil of her eyes open to the void. "You'll be there," she murmured almost to herself, "in the dark, waiting, and so will I." The wind carried her words away into the endless, fractured sky, and for a moment the rift seemed to answer.